and what we're doing at 48 Hills is we're thinking about post-COVID San Francisco, and we recognize that COVID has changed the city a lot, and that the city that emerges 6 months, a year, 2 years from now will be different from the city of the past. I mean, in ways like, what are we going to do with 10 or 15 million square feet of empty office space downtown? What are we going to do about Muni, which is designed to bring people from certain neighborhoods to downtown, right? But more important, what are we going to do with the economy? How are we going to remake the city in a way that's a positive thing? I see all the time, I know that that SPUR, the San Francisco Planning and Urban Research Association, has a plan out for San Francisco 2050. And they have all these scenarios, which are generally more of the same. Generally, how we should have a city that is guided by more growth in the tech, finance, insurance, and real estate sector, more private market housing, more of the type of things that lead to the type of displacement that we've seen in the last 20 years, but increasingly in the last 10 years in San Francisco. The MTC and ABAG have their Bay Area 2040 plan that, again, is more of the same. And a lot of us are already starting to fight back against those plans. And that is what always happens after there's some type of crisis in San Francisco, is the powers that be come up with their plans, and those of us in the progressive movement, in working class and Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities are fighting back. So what we wanted to do at 48 Hills is come up with a community-based alternative. What should San Francisco look like? What is our vision of San Francisco in the future? And I'm not talking about 48 Hills vision or Tim Redmond's vision, certainly. I'm talking about the vision of the folks in this room, of a community. And what does a community-based plan look like? And my idea is, we're holding a couple forums. We did one on economic justice a few weeks ago. We're talking about racial justice tonight. In a couple more weeks, we'll talk about climate justice. We recognize that these are all completely intersectional. And in the meantime, we're going out and doing interviews. I want to thank Matthew Guinasso, our summer intern from the University of San Francisco, who's working with us on this. Next week, I will be starting with my Economics of Social Justice class at the University of San Francisco, and all of those students will be participating in this, interviewing dozens and dozens of people, going out to communities and saying, what does a community-based plan look like? And circulating that around, and I see 48 Hills as simply the platform to publish these voices. And I would like to come up with the money to print this into a pamphlet, a booklet that we can circulate around, that is the community-based plan for the future of San Francisco. So tonight we're going to be talking about racial justice as a part of that. And I know that all of you see this as intersectional too, that you can't just move one piece of the puzzle. Racial justice is housing justice, is economic justice, is climate justice. And with that in mind, what I'm going to ask all the panelists to do is to talk for 10 minutes or so about your vision of what does racial justice look like in the new San Francisco, in the post-COVID San Francisco. And then we'll open it up for discussion. Let me introduce the panel. We really appreciate people coming. As I say, this has been kind of a moving panel with the pandemic and schedules, getting the right mix of people and getting people in here. And some people who are going to be here tonight were not able to be here. Ben Boxiera, for example, was unable to make it tonight. I understand people have a lot going on right now. But the panelists that we have, and I'm really, really honored to have all of them. Greg Castro is the principal cultural consultant for the Association of Ramaytush-Ohlone people. And I'm very, very pleased and honored. Greg, you honor us with your presence. Dr. Kim-Shree Maufas is an educator whose avocation is working with vulnerable communities. She is a former member of the San Francisco School Board, and I know that she'll be talking about education somewhat tonight. Jeantelle Laberinto works as a community organizer with people.power.media. And I was very honored to have Jeantelle in my class in the Masters in Urban and Public Affairs program, and I'm very honored to have her here tonight. And Dr. Rupa Marya is a physician, a teacher at the University of California, San Francisco. And also she's a founder of the Do No Harm Coalition. And also, I'm going to try to make this work, folks. She is the author of Inflamed, Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Injustice. Can you see that? Marquis is working. This is a phenomenal book. Mine hasn't arrived yet, but I've already ordered it. I would encourage all of you to order this book or buy it from an independent local bookseller. It's extremely important. It's gotten great reviews. Her co-author is Raj Patel. She has been on a book tour promoting this book, and I really appreciate the fact that she has taken a few minutes out of her incredibly busy life to join us here tonight. Thank you, and a round of virtual applause for all of the panelists. Thank you all for being here. I would really like to start with Greg, since we started off acknowledging that we are on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush-Ohlone people. Help us frame this discussion, Greg. Talk about what racial justice means from your perspective in the future of San Francisco.
And how many days do I have to do this?
We got an hour and a half. I'm not keeping people past an hour and a half, but if you want to talk for 10 or 15 minutes, that'd be fantastic.
Wow. Okay. I'll give it to you in a nutshell. Well, let me start out by saying that for most people, when I address them, one of the things I often say is unless they are themselves indigenous or deeply embedded with the indigenous community, I usually kind of say, whatever you think you know, put it to the side. Because most of the sources for that information did not come from the indigenous people themselves. It came from academia, from books written by people that came and thought they understood us and then wrote books and textbooks and have built careers on teaching that information. And certainly in my 30 plus years of activism, I can tell you, knowing a lot of those activists and also a lot of those academics, especially in California, that they missed a lot, to put it conservatively. I think that one of the things I was just thinking about in the last couple of days, reading some of the articles about both the pandemic and people's reaction to it, climate change, and especially with the wildfires here in California, that our society and our people are trained to think very linearly and in a binary way. And usually one of those ways is the good way and the other way is the bad way. And it doesn't allow a lot of room for really you can intellectually talk about alternatives and other options, but really what it comes down to is almost always two choices, and one's good, one's bad. That seems to be the paradigm of the social structure we're in. And as the pressure goes up, that becomes more reinforced. And I think we're seeing that, for instance, in the reaction of people with the whole vaccination, and especially with the mask debate. That to me is really indicative of the crisis that people are in at a personal level. They're acting, it's not rational. And that's why the appeals to rationality, objectivity, and science aren't working with most of those people, because that's not where they're at. They're thinking in a very, I wouldn't even say emotional way. They're thinking at a very gut level, because they feel their very existence is at stake. And in some cases it is. And as a Native person, having grown up understanding my recent history after 15,000 years of being here in California, the last 250 years have been a little rough, to the point where the Ramaytush have actually been pushed out of Yelamu, what you now call San Francisco, entirely. There's almost none of our descendants are there anymore. I happen to live in the South Bay. Other people have scattered from Yelamu, and that's been true for the last couple of generations, because the conditions there were not conducive to our continued existence. And so, in a sense, as Native people, California Native people have already survived a pandemic, and we're dealing with that pandemic of invasion and colonization and genocide, and we've been dealing with that for 2.5 centuries now. And there is a light at the end of the tunnel, but it comes with a lot of pain and discomfort and sorrow and resilience and determination. So I'm not sure I have an exact answer for everybody, but I know there's an answer. And for us as Native people, we may have lost a lot of our traditional ways and social constructs, and it's all very confused for a lot of our people. A lot of it was ripped from them, literally, as you're hearing in the recent news articles about residential schools, cemeteries being found, which is no surprise to any Native person with any knowledge. No surprise whatsoever. To the rest of the world, it's like, what? What are you talking about? When did that happen? Well, it happened right under your nose. It happened through the auspices of your own government. And it was well known at the time and promoted. And we're not talking about ancient times. We're talking in the United States all the way into the 1970s. 1970s. So I know elders who literally have been ripped from their homes, shipped off to boarding schools, and in a couple of cases, never saw their parents again. And they're still alive. So we're not talking something in the history book. We're talking about a living history, a living memory, a living consequence. And that has rippled through our communities. So those are all things that may seem not involved with what we're talking about, but are very much are, I think, because they're built into the society. They're built into the social construct. They're built into the political, economic structure that we're all living under. And I think things like Rupa's book have started to push that issue, because it's stuff that Native people have been saying all along. I grew up with elders telling me these things, but beyond us, nobody was listening, because, it's like, well, what would they expect the Indians to say? They aren't happy with how things turned out. Well, now most of us are unhappy with how things turned out through the same mechanisms. Those mechanisms ultimately don't care if you're black, white, male, female, or other, what color, what creed, what culture you came from. None of that matters. It's an extraction society, and it only wants to extract from you, to utilize you, to take advantage of you, as long as they can, for as much as they can. That's the mechanism. That's the machine, the system we're dealing with. Certainly there are good people and bad people, if you want to use that word, on either side. But we're not talking about people. We're talking about systems now. And then people choose to be part of that system. And sometimes they choose out of fear. And I think we're seeing a lot of that now. They're choosing to be a part of the system, and whatever loudest part of that system speaks to them in their fears. So we're getting a lot of irrational discussion. And I think we really have to address those fears and those feelings and those emotions before we can get to any sort of cogent discussion about solutions. Because I think there's actually lots of solutions, and we're working on some of them now. But we won't get to a critical mass of that until people's fears are allayed in some way. And I think we're just beginning to grasp that concept. Thank you.
Do you want to share with us you said and I'm going to shift to Dr. Rupa in a minute, because I know she's also involved in this, but do you want to talk for a minute about some of the solutions that you are working on?
Well, our philosophy, to put it crudely, to give you the lifetime of learning in 30 seconds, we don't own things. We use those and are forced to use those English words and concepts because we can't really tell you how we really believe, because it would be totally alien to most of you. Heck, it was alien to me as I was growing up, here in the South Bay of San Francisco, and seeing my hometown turn into Silicon Valley, as I call it. And I'm a employee of that Silicon Valley for almost a half a century now, and seeing what it does to people, and trying to conflate that and combine that with the indigenous values I was brought up with, and certainly lack of possession. And one of the things that I'm working on with my dear friend Rupa is land back. And people automatically think land back is give the land back to the native people. Well, if you have a deed and you want to sign it over, yeah, I'll take it. I have no problem with that. But that's actually not where we would start. And in one sense, land back isn't giving land back to the natives. It's getting the natives back to the land in a connected way that fulfills their spiritual, cultural responsibilities to the land that gave birth to them. Our stories tell us we're literally made from the place we came from. We're literally made from it. My dad's Salinan people who are south of the Ohlone, their stories tell them they're made at the base of a sacred mountain that's now in Los Padres National Forest, and they're made from the elderberry branch from a bush on the side of their sacred mountain. They're literally made from that place. And that's what connects them and binds them to a place. So you can't separate the people from the place they came from. And even though it's been tried and nearly successful in the case of the Ramaytush, we're still around. We had the audacity to survive genocide, and we're still trying to fulfill our responsibility to take care of the land and the people on it. And even though our ancestors may not have envisioned newcomers coming, especially in the quantities that they have, that obligation, that sacred commitment to our land still stands, that we take care of the land and the people on it. So one of the projects I'm working on with Rupa is acquiring land down south of San Francisco to grow food, among many other things we're going to do there. And we're going to distribute that to the community in the places that it's needed most.
Dr. Rupa, do you want to pick up on this and talk a little more about that and what you're doing and concepts that emerge from your book and anything else that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I guess I just want to say I'm talking to you today from the unceded occupied territory of Huichin in what is now Oakland, California. I was born and raised in Ramaytush-Ohlone territory. My family were refugees of colonial terror from Punjab in India, and I love this place. And listening to Greg, I just feel like, Tim, if there's an opportunity in the work that you're doing in reframing San Francisco or rethinking of Yelamu, maybe we should start with that. Its name, proper name, a name that doesn't include colonial terror, is to really give Greg like a whole hour and a half to talk, because what I've learned by just sitting with him and what I continue to learn in his presence and how he sees and understands things, I feel like if we all just slowed down and took time to listen to our elders like Greg in this work, and to start from where the wounds started. So where did the wounds of racism start here in this land? They started with this genocide and the continual cultural erasure of Indigenous people. And so if we start from that place of supporting Indigenous people in getting back to land and uplifting their ancestral responsibilities, when you think about it that way, something that Tribal Chair Jonathan Cordero says is that, people in Western culture, in this culture, US culture, talk about their rights. And Indigenous people, you'll hear what all the words, that language Greg was using was language of responsibility and language of duty. These are duties that people have to each other and to the land. And that's why their work is always intersectional. So if you're talking about racial justice, you're talking about climate justice, you're talking about economic justice, you're talking about all those things all at once. So in this work of reimagining Yelamu, and maybe that's what the series could be called, something like that, I just wish, I would just hope that we could give a lot of time to listening to Greg, because I think he's got a lot of wisdom. Even though he doesn't have answers, the way in which he frames the questions and is thinking about this stuff actively opens a lot of our colonial mindsets that we're all programmed to think in to other possibilities. So as we hear him speak, we're like, oh, does it need to be that way? And I say that because if we start from that place, I think what we'll find is the culture of responsibility will then predicate everything that comes after it. So all the all the layers of interaction along axes of justice. And so it is a great honor to work with Greg and Jonathan on this land work that we're doing in San Gregorio. We're growing food. We are reframing farming as an act of ecological care under Indigenous sovereignty, and reframing farmers as frontline health workers. So giving them salaries that doctors and nurses would have to grow food. And then that food is liberated from the market economy. That food is grown through, I call it more organic farming. So it's organic plus all the good stuff we're doing to the soil microbiology and to the water, and all that reconnection of people to land, that we're working with our director of traditional ecological knowledge, Sage LaPena, on that work of reconnecting to the plants. And then that food will be coming up to the American Indian Cultural District and Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation to be given away to people who need that kind of food the most. So what we're seeing with COVID, a study came out of Tufts, 67% of the hospital admissions with COVID were people suffering from some sort of nutritionally related disease, whether you cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity. While these things are nutritionally related, they're also compounded by structures of racism and debt and the oppression of colonial capitalist society on anyone who's not basically the 1%. And so that work of reframing food as, a responsibility that we have to each other to make sure that everyone has access to not just food, but really vibrant, healthy, culturally relevant food, nutritious food, food that's going to heal you when you eat it, not the stuff from the food bank, which is laced with pesticides. And so I would love to see Yelamu really involved in the work of decolonizing and to really putting forth the agendas of our Indigenous people. And I have a feeling all the rest of us will fall into a good place if we do that. That's not to invisibilize or to minimize all the layers of racism and structures that have really crushed marginalized, minoritized people. It's that when we align in that way, when we correct that first incorrection by realizing whose land we are on and really working under their sovereignty, they, and I speak from knowing them, they want to uplift all of us. And so that's just the perspective I have to offer. It's really healthcare work. This is healthcare work. And that's why I'm really excited to be involved in it.
Thank you so much. And I really like the idea of reimagining Yelamu as part of what we can help facilitate. I think that's a great frame to put all of this in. And I really appreciate this. Do you want to talk for just a minute or two about your book and some of the ideas that you have in your book? I encourage people to go out and get the book as soon as they can, but while you're here, do you want to just give us a couple of ideas from what you're talking about in your book?
Yeah, so the book that I wrote with Raj Patel, and Raj used to be here in San Francisco as well. He's a food systems activist, a policy professor. He's worked a lot with frontline communities of peasant farmers in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America. This book really looks at inflammation of our societies, of our bodies, and our planet. And it's not just a metaphor, it's a literal framework to understanding what inflammation is. Most of the diseases I treat in the hospital at UCSF, including COVID, are inflammatory diseases. And colonized people and those who suffer the most under the brunt of social oppression of colonial capitalism suffer the greatest proportion of inflammatory diseases. Now, inflammation is the body's normal response to damage or the threat of damage. And what we're seeing is when that damage is ongoing through environmental exposures, whether it's police violence, whether it's intergenerational trauma, whether it's air pollution, the crap in the Hunters Point Bayview, the Bayview Hunters Point, the radioactive material, all these things compound and they add up as exposures. And they are tuning the immune system so that when it encounters a stressor, it reacts. And that stressor right now we're seeing is COVID. So this is why you're seeing groups that are more socially oppressed responding with a more robust, inflammatory, severe COVID is what we see. Now, this is not to argue that there's some sort of biological essentialism that, Black and brown bodies are somehow predestined to poor outcomes. It's to describe that racism and structures of racism are a form of biological warfare that need to be urgently dismantled for public health. And so the book gives it's a little heavy on the science in the beginning, and I did that because I wanted to fashion rocks for all of my activist friends to throw very strategically at this system because it's damaging people's health. And I can do only so much in the hospital, getting people insulin and helping them get set up on dialysis. But to actually stem the tide of inflammatory disease, we need to start dismantling these systems. And San Francisco or Yalamu would be a great place to start. And to see what kind of public health benefits could be garnered from abolishing the police, or developing different forms of community safety, or developing different schooling structures during COVID. It's insanity to me that we're sending all of our unvaccinated kids through a giant national experiment so that working class people can get back to work and keep the engine of capitalism running when it's destroying our planet. So to me, it's like, if we have data of Delta going like this and knowing that fires are happening and we're going to have to shut the windows and there goes our ventilation strategy, what the hell are we doing? Why are we not acting on the data that we have to keep our children safe? Whether it's the temperatures rising from the IPCC report, the AQI rising, the Delta virus rising, I don't see any purposeful action, even on a city level, to secure the safety of our children. And so to me, I'm against child sacrifice. Colonial capitalism is all for child sacrifice. We need to stop that sickness right here, right now. And so I would like to see some bold policies that bring food system back into the control of local community, that bring health back into the control of local community, and that bring education back into the control of the frontline workers. I don't know a single teacher who's excited to be in a classroom with 30 kids right now. I really don't. So let's listen to those voices and really seize the resources that we bring forth in the city to structure our public health. Because really the next 50 years is all going to be about keeping people safe. And who do I trust to do that? Do I trust the people who are in office right now? No, they kept thousands of people in the streets in the worst air that we've ever had in San Francisco. With the pandemic, we were forced to send unhoused people into the streets. So these people are defunct in terms of leadership. And it really is time for us to get more radical and militant about seizing the resources of the city to work for the people, for keeping everybody safe. And so that's what this book's about. If you don't want to read it, Raj and I narrate it in over 13 hours and 32 minutes. I could not stand to listen to my voice for that long, but my husband apparently likes it. So maybe that's another way to take in the book.
That's fantastic. Are you, I know you're on a book tour. Are you doing any local events?
I am not doing any events in person because of Delta, and I really wanted to. We were going to have an event on the farm, and I was very sad to have to cancel it, but I need to walk my talk. So I am doing it all very safely.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And that's a good transition actually to Kim-Shree talking about, you were on the school board for years. And you are not now, so you are free to talk about it without worrying about angering the superintendent. But maybe you could start with what Dr. Rupa was saying, and then take us through from your experience as an educator in San Francisco and as a elected official in San Francisco, how you see ways that the city can respond to racial injustice and work towards a more racially just society.
Well, first of all, let me just acknowledge this panel. Thank you. And yes and yes and yes. So a few things, just to go back into sort of this immediate universe, a couple of things. So yes, kids are in school, and if you're paying attention to the politics of that, because that's what that is, right? That's the politics of it's not just the capitalism and all that, but there's the political push there. And when we talk about folks who are on the school board, right? Those are the folks in charge of schools, right? There's a superintendent, right? So this is the house. There's the superintendent and the staff, and that includes teachers and people who are at schools. And then there's the governing body, which is the Board of Education. And they have that one employee, the superintendent, and he's got the rest of the house, right? So it's 7 to 1 person, and then that one person runs the rest of the house with help. But as you can see right now, currently, they're trying to recall 3 school board members, right? If you somehow don't please folks, or if you somehow don't say the right thing, or your advocacy doesn't line up with the power structures that exist here in San Francisco, you know, folks will take action. And that action looks like this recall, right? It looks like some of that. Some of that action looks like the infighting, the very public infighting that was among the school board that, you know, not only that, but it fought with the Board of Supervisors. You know, you'll just see it just, you know, whatever was kept inside the house of the schools is out in the public. So, you know, the idea that we couldn't say, keep kids safe. By the way, teachers are telling you, no, we don't want to be in schools. Their contract still hasn't been settled, and it's over a year, right? So normally we would hear about that. We'd hear that the teacher's contract isn't signed. We'd hear that the SEIU, that's UESF for the teachers, or SEIU isn't signed. So all of that political push and pull with adults, right? While they're fighting, our kids are being put into schools and in a crazy unsafe spaces because we're in the middle of this pandemic and it is not over, and the variants are scary. And because they're unvaccinated, that helps all of that. And you know, I'm not a doctor of the alphabet, but you know, medical, but we just can imagine all of the variations that will manifest with our young people who are unvaccinated, and they're gonna take that back home. So there's that part, and there's a political aspect that cannot be ignored. So I want to acknowledge the political push that's so overwhelming and oppressive that people will do things that they wouldn't do in any other space. And for me, as an former elected official, I could only participate at that kind of level for so long. And I knew that going in. So I knew I was going to be there for 8 years, and I was going to go do something else. So that's not the way I see the world. I like to work in community and be with community. And there are many others also who agree with that. One of the things that I want to also point to, Tim and the panel and folks that are here, is that what was said around the food, right? Food is such an, and by the way, every kid in California is getting free meals, right? We have free food but the quality of that food is not good. So who cares if it's free if it's not going to nourish children, our most precious beings? Then who cares if it's free? But it's free, and we're using, you know, we're in the system, so we're using those companies that are being paid to provide this food that is packaged and with pesticides and all that stuff. How do we expect them to grow and be able to, you know, consume that food and then go and learn? So there's so many layers of, again, the capitalists, the politics, all of those things that are at play and that are just being served up to our young ones. And they don't really have a say, right? Because they're not 18, they can't vote. Do they vote? If children could vote, we'd see a different way of life. But unfortunately, they cannot, and they just have to sort of take what's being given to them in lots of spaces, unless they have really, you know, clever, and you don't have to be that clever, but really activist parents that say, I'm not going to take that, and I'm not going to let you give that to my child. But while you're trying to live and survive in San Francisco, can you take the time, mental space, and time to do that, right? So there's all those things, all those layers happening while we're just trying to exist here without going under, without being houseless, without, putting our families at risk, without getting COVID ourselves. All of those things are at play. And then we're trying to learn. There are so many really amazing people out there fighting this fight around racial justice and putting it together in a classroom for young people to learn and gather and grasp so they can speak up for themselves and advocate for themselves. That's right. We need that all the time, all day, and they need to learn really early. But there are also systems of oppression. And as is any young person speaking up, and I could say racial, but any young person speaking up for themselves for justice, there's a level of oppression from adults that will not have it. This won't have it. Because it disrupts all of the systems that are already in place that run well without disruption and continue for the haves. Now, you had a question, Tim, whatever it was, I missed it.
No, that's okay. This is great. I wanted you to pick up on what Dr. Rupa said and talk about it. And also, anything else you want to say from all of your experience as a community activist and educator about steps that you see post-COVID San Francisco taking towards racial justice.
Your question that brought me to the table, which was, post-COVID, what does it look like around education? So I'll point to a couple of things because we've tried some of that here, and the backlash has been public. By the way, the immediate backlash is crazy public, and Greg knows something about it because I'm going to talk about the renaming of schools. And it was like national news. Really, the national news to rename the school? That seems a bit much, right? Come on. Don't we have so many other really serious things to be concerned about? No. You're changing the name and you're changing the system, because change the name lets us recognize that there's a system in place that we want to address. And we want to address it with our youngest human beings and have them understand that, by the way, there's a system that put that name there on that space that you're going to learn in, and we want to change it for the reasons da 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 da. But the backlash was crazy, right? So let's try to even get to the space where we can acknowledge this stuff that we have with our young people learning in those spaces that person or those people did some stuff that wasn't okay, and explain it at age appropriate levels. This is why we're going to make that change. That's why we're going to make that shift. But we as adults can't seem to get that together. And if we can't get that together, well, we're going to stop it. And that's what happened. I love that Oakland Unified School District had passed a reparations resolution, right? That is groundbreaking and historic, period. The governing body of the Oakland Unified School District passed a reparations for African-American children in the Oakland Unified School District. That means that they get that the education and the environment when those children were learning is not okay. It's full of oppression. It's doing everything it can to continue the system of them not having what they should have. And to even begin, we're going to need help to even address some of those things, because that means all those people that have or have advantages or take advantage either have to give it up willingly or have it taken from them. And since most people aren't willing to give up the good that they have, which is way more than others, or give up the advantages that they have. So in a public school system, if you didn't like that, you go to private school, right? Where you could pay for it. You'll pay for the advantage. But if you're in the public school system, which means it's public for everyone, and everyone should have these advantages, you've got to be willing to, adults have got to be willing to either help folks give up those advantages so everybody can have it and you can level that playing field, or you've got to take it. And again, you can hear the very public backlash when folks who are in power, governing bodies, try to take it from folks who have the advantages, because there's a recall. So going forward, we've got to get past ourselves and help others who won't give up the advantage. You got to take it so it can be level for everyone. We got, until you get to there, I want to say what it would look like. It would like, if everyone would have these same advantages. Everybody would get an equitable, really robust, woke education. But we can't get there until we get to the folks who have all that good stuff, and in the public system don't understand that everybody's supposed to have the good stuff. But we're in a system where it's good, they're good schools, and there are not good schools, not good schools. That's the system. It's not a system of all the schools are good. No. We don't have a system like that. We exist in a system where there are good and there are not good. And why wouldn't everybody want the good?
Kim-Shree, thank you so much. I don't know how many of you have read Heather McGhee's book, The Sum of Us, but she really talks about this. She talks about why racism has prevented everyone in the United States from having a much better society. And that's along with Dr. Rupa Marya's book. I highly recommend Heather McGhee's book, The Sum of Us. But let me shift over now to Jeantelle, who has been waiting so patiently. Jeantelle is a community organizer, but she's also run political campaigns in San Francisco. She's worked on a number of different political campaigns, and she knows what it's like to try to get things done on the ground. And she also, I will say, if there's one thing that all of our panelists and our hosts so far have in common, is that we are all a little bit older. And Jeantelle has a younger person's perspective on what it's like trying to live in San Francisco now, trying to be a part of San Francisco, and trying to be a community organizer in San Francisco. So I'm really honored and pleased that Jeantelle is here with us, and take it away. Take us from what you've heard so far and synthesize this for us, and tell us what you see as the future of a post-COVID San Francisco with racial justice.
Wow, thank you so much, Tim. That was great. I love the introduction. Thank you for calling me young. I definitely don't feel like it, but I want to thank my fellow panelists for those really powerful testimonies. I'm just learning so much being in the space with you all. But as Tim has mentioned, yes, I'm a community organizer and writer. I've written for 48 Hills. You can find some stories on your site. Born and raised here in San Francisco in Nilamu. And just really excited to be here and speak with you all. But in the interest of time and to make sure we have plenty of time for discussion with the audience, I'll ground a lot of my thoughts in the work we're doing at People Power Media. That still, of course, has kind of a bold vision for how we can center equity as we move to a post-COVID, even though we're still in COVID world. So, as a result of the pandemic, we had and have millions of folks unemployed, unable to sustain themselves and their families. We're wondering how we're going to keep a roof over our heads, all while trying to shelter in place and social distance to avoid COVID spread. And for the folks who have unfortunately been infected with COVID, not having accessible and affordable healthcare to recover is also another burden that they have to carry. So many issues coming up, already amplified in the wake of the pandemic. But meanwhile, as our communities are continuing to suffer from lack of real support, and we're considering the changing landscape regarding the eviction moratorium, access to rent relief, unemployment relief, a lot of the world wants to return back to normal, right? As if that ever worked for any of us in the first place. And we're in such an unsteady and precarious position, unsure of how everyday people are going to be able to recover. Yet we have folks in the city like planners and politicians reverting back to business as usual, right? We're seeing things like large-scale rezoning plans continuing to be passed. We're seeing approvals of high-end market rate development being pushed through. And a lot of this is things that folks like you and me, low-income folks, people, the majority of San Franciscans can't afford. So while the city is carrying on with business as usual, they're not doing enough to address the material needs of our communities and the issues I mentioned just minutes before. People have lost their jobs. They don't know if they can afford rent. They don't know if an eviction's around the corner. And many have already been evicted illegally, right? And meanwhile, the city is continuing to prioritize plans that don't cater to the needs of the people and instead benefit developers and those in power. To put it simply, it's a disaster, right? Also, sorry, I have a dog here
That's
who
okay.
wants to play. He's 6 months old, I apologize. But it's a disaster. And I think it really lays bare the major inequities we have in our city and across the nation, of course, and proves to us that we need to pivot from these current systems and instead move towards ones that prioritize our community's dignity, their health and their stability. So I think if we're talking about racial and social equity, planners and politicians have to actually prioritize our needs, right, of the most vulnerable. That includes people of color, working class folks, low income folks, our unhoused neighbors, and really making equity and anti-racism, focal points and not afterthoughts, can really help guide development in our city that is really destabilizing and displacing a lot of our folks. So at People Power Media, our co-founders, Diane Ruiz and Joseph Smook, who's in this room, shout out to Joseph, you can wave your hand, created a series of articles that actually describes a framework called the DAX framework. It stands for desegregation, affordability, culture and arts, stability and sustainability, that lays out how we can approach planning in a more equitable way and what we can do in a post-COVID world to prioritize equity. I can drop it here in the chat. I wish I could go through the entire series, but I know we don't have much time. Let me put it here. But I urge folks to read it more in depth and see, an actual outline of what we can do to actually create equity in our city. But one thing I wanted to share with you all is something that's really powerful that has grown out of this DAX framework is a new coalition called the Race and Equity in All Planning Coalition that People Power Media is helping lead alongside over 30 grassroots organizations in various neighborhoods representing multiple communities throughout the city. And this is a really new, I think it's our 1 year, our first birthday was just this month in August. We're 1 year old, we're just a little baby, but our purpose is to create an entirely new race and equity framework for self-determination of marginalized communities. And it's kind of an unprecedented coalition. There are a lot of organizations and we're all trying to build under this unified vision of racial and social equity in city planning, with land use, with housing, to see how we can, really make sure that we're prioritizing our folks. Thanks, Joseph, for putting that in the chat. That is our Race and Equity in All Planning Coalition, REP for short. That's our website. We are building a new one, which will be live in a few months, but you can check it out there for a list of orgs. And in this coalition, we are addressing multiple issues that impact our communities, including the San Francisco housing element, which will guide plans for housing for the next 8 years. And we know here in San Francisco, it's an affordable housing crisis. Folks cannot afford to live here. It is insanely expensive and really difficult. We're seeing kind of the erasure and disappearance of our communities in real time. We're also focusing on the regional housing needs allocation, RHNA allocations, which quantifies the need for housing within each jurisdiction in a region, among other things. But what's really critical is that we're pushing forward a proactive and bold vision that puts our community's expertise at the forefront of decision-making around housing and land use and planning. And this includes, you could see on this website, we created our own definition of equity. All 30 of our organizations went through and created this. We have listed what we think equity is and what we think it isn't. We are investing in the leadership of folks in our coalition and really lifting up the different struggles, the different communities, but realizing we're all unified and we're all connected in us wanting to support our communities. Our communities know the solutions they need. because we live with these issues every day, and folks in power need to listen to our communities and follow our lead if racial and social equity are truly a priority. And I think I'll be quick, maybe another minute, but
That's fine. You can go ahead. Take your time.
okay, thanks. I want to make sure we have time for questions, but I think another major issue we're really seeing is, you know, the city and even corporations and folks all over really co-opting progressive and radical language and almost reducing it to buzzwords. How many times do we hear the word equity? Like, what does equity mean now when we're seeing places like Bank of America throw it out and say we're focusing on equity in our organization when we know the really harmful things they do? How do you actualize equity? What does it mean? And last June, the Planning Commission actually passed a resolution that acknowledged planning's racist past, and they said they would commit to centering racial and social equity moving forward. And this resolution was written really in the wake of the uprisings last year for Black Lives. And many community organizations were part of crafting that and shaping that resolution, and it is really powerful. But here it is, here we have this resolution saying the city wants to really focus on racial and social equity. It's been a year. Where is it real? Is it here? Is it something that we can actually look at? Is it tangible? And I would argue that most of us in this room would say that it's not, and that we're still seeing inequities in real time. So while we're contending with planning's actions that they've acknowledged that have displaced and destabilized and erased whole communities, we're also contending with the real issues our communities are facing in this pandemic. And I think it just really makes it clear that what we have isn't working for us. I mean, it works for the ultra rich who've actually benefited and profited off of this really awful moment in history, but not for the rest of us who want to be healthy and safe and stay in place with and inside our communities. So I think, you know, all of that is to say is it's time for new systems, and we need to move away from these systems that are just not helping us and not supporting us. So I want to stop there because I feel like I've been talking for 10 minutes, but thank you all for listening, and I'm excited for questions and opening it up for folks.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Jeantelle, and thank you to all the panelists. I'm sure people will have questions. If you have questions, please either put them in the chat or raise your hand, and I can see you as participants. I'm looking to see if anyone's got their hand raised. If you have any questions, or if you just want to join the conversation and make some points and add on to what people were saying while we're waiting to see if there's more questions. Let me just say, Jeantelle, you know, it's very interesting. I've often thought to myself, we have this huge Department of City Planning that we spend a lot of money on. And mostly they don't really do any planning. What they do is respond to developers. And the planning is done in rooms that you and I are never in, where developers and their allies sit down and say, this is the San Francisco that we want in the future. And then all the planning department does is, you know, hold hearings and stamp permits, right? I mean, it kind of seems like that. So talk to us about what a different vision of that is. What does community-based planning look like?
That's a great question. And I love that you have said that, yeah, planning so often just kind of stamps things and is like almost a permit department, right? I think community-based planning, when I think of planning, right, it's so amazing. And Tim, I know I was in that program, Urban and Public Affairs at USF, where we talked a lot about what planning does. And you read these books and read descriptions on planning's website where they say, we want to invest in the well-being and health and livability of communities. But I think the major thing to think about is the folks in the community who've been living there, who have roots there, who know what it's like to be in community with neighbors. They know the solutions they need. They know what would make their community run. They know what they need to be stable and to be healthy. And if, you know, so often planning and these departments really take a top-down approach of, we know what's best for you. We've been doing this for a long time. We know what your streets need. We know, you know, what your community needs, another Target on the corner. Your community needs this, but it's really a matter of not just listening and making sure that you capture the thoughts of communities, but how do you make those suggestions and those recommendations actually meaningful, and actually having them, community members, lead these plans and lead these ideas, and not just be participants, but the people at the forefront. And it's something really difficult to do, like I said, when we have this resolution that says we're going to center equity, or we have we have a new Office of Racial Equity in the city as well. And we have all these departments from different spaces using this word as if it's something that's a given, and that it's something that that can be achieved just by listening to communities. But if we're not actually putting decision making in communities' hands, then it's kind of for naught. So I guess that's kind of my answer to that. Let me know if you have another question.
No, and it plays actually very well into what Kim-Shree was saying too, about people who have the power and who have the resources not wanting to give it up. When I think about equity, I think about Feinstein's definition of equity, and the phrase that I've always really liked that she wrote is, equity is by definition redistributive. Equity means that you are taking power and wealth away from those who have it and giving it to those who don't. And that is something that the city and county of San Francisco, like most of United States government, has been very bad at, right? Has not wanted to even talk about, that the, Kim-Shree, you didn't mention the situation at Lowell, but I know that was on your mind when you're talking about this, that, there's people who have had the privilege of attending this school, very few of them African-Americans. And when you start opening that up by changing the incredibly racist and biased systems of admission to this top-ranked school, people get mad because they don't want to see, because it's, in an ideal world, every high school in San Francisco would have all of the programs that Lowell does. That would involve taking money in a different way from different people and putting it into these school efforts. But that's something that I think, whenever you talk about equity, if you're not talking about equity as being redistributive, you're not really talking about equity, my personal opinion.
No, that's not personal opinion, that's the facts, right? Taking that good that people have been holding on to, and just as you said, redistributing it to folks who haven't had it. There were many schools that had Title I money, but because the demographics had changed and no one had gone back to reassess the school, people just kept it. We just kept that money that were for students that needed it, right? Didn't say anything.
Rupa, I see you're waving your hands. Do you want to jump in here?
Well, just Tim, you said that the U.S. is not very good at redistributing, and I think that the U.S. is great at redistributing, but just taking the wealth from the middle class and the poor and redistributing it to the 1%. So that redistribution has happened as wealth has increasingly been concentrated in the hands of the 1%. So I think that what we've really lost is a sense of class solidarity and learning how to organize in ways to get that wealth back. And they're not going to give it to us. We're going to have to fight for it. So that's, how do we organize that fight together with the food system, working with the school system, working with the housing that we're talking about, making sure people get to stay in their communities. And so that's really, I think that that's really on us, is to be building those movement alliances so that we're working in concert with each other.
And can I add on to that? And inherent in that is we've got to also educate ourselves on how to not fight amongst each other for titles, for status, for hierarchy. Right? Because then those are the same systems which we've been indoctrinated in for many generations, right? We also have to learn how to work together in these coalitions to build that, all of what we were talking about, right? Because
well, that's, yeah, Kim, and I think that that's, for me, one of the places where I really love working with our Indigenous communities, because it forces me to constantly check what I think I know. And it's constant, and it literally is unsettling. And that word is so meaningful, and that I am constantly like, oh shit, I didn't know this, I didn't know that. And it's reminding myself that I'm a guest on these lands, and I was forced here through my own family story of dealing with the theft and land theft and resource theft of our homelands. But so as I'm here working with those communities, the forcing into that place is a really good way, I feel, for all of us who are settled on this land, all of us settlers, no matter what our racial demographic is, to start from that place, because then we are starting to work under a system that's not this one. That's a different one. And that's one that has a really long history and relationship here, even as our friends like Greg are reawakening those relationships and repairing those broken threads. I don't know. I just think that I've really enjoyed that. It's been a constant learning. And I think it gets at exactly that, how to learn together how to decolonize these power structures.
Agree.
And you're absolutely right, Rupa. I spoke wrongly when I said the United States is not good at redistributing. We basically redistributed an entire nation's land into private hands, and we took all of the land that was. I'm not going to use the word owned, because Greg made it clear to me that that's not the appropriate term, but that was inhabited, that was used, that was taken care of, that land that was taken care of by indigenous people. And I think that's a better term than owned. Correct me if I'm wrong, Greg. But we took that land that was being taken care of and we put it into private capitalist hands. And that's probably one of the greatest redistributions of wealth in the history of society. What the colonial mentality in the United States.
Absolutely. And it was, and that philosophy of objectifying and quantifying and commodifying everything has filtered into virtually every aspect of the society, to include people, to include our young people, right? Both Kim-Shree and Rupa were both talking about it in terms of the school system, right? Our kids are being forced to go to, you got to go to school. We know, we know, but we don't want to talk about how dangerous it is. There's all kinds of things we do. They're kids, they'll get over it. It's not really that dangerous. It's all the adults that are really yelling and screaming, but they need to go to school. And what I hear a lot of is articles talking about how if we don't get them back at school, they're going to fall behind. Okay. So what if they fall behind? And what are they going to fall behind on? And what's the alternative? That they actually might still continue to live in a healthy manner by not going to school. That's an option. So I think that when we're so conditioned now, and I said earlier about when I started out talking about the fear that's driving this, that anything that is not in alignment is conflict, which isn't true, but that's the feeling that gets engendered by some people, especially when their position and privilege is being challenged in some way. And I mean challenged, not even threatened, just challenged. Because really, in the scheme of things, how much have we really moved the needle? Not that much, but it was enough to make a lot of people fearful, not just uncomfortable, fearful, and they're reacting that way, to where our differences are now conflicts. And that is something we deal with locally as well, to say some of these concepts that are indigenous, that have been part of our culture and community for literally thousands and thousands of years and worked well, despite the myth of colonial history. They worked very well. And now all of a sudden we're talking those terms, like you'd said, we don't own the land. Oh, well, if you're not going to own the land, then we'll own it. Well, no, that's not the option. And so now we have to kind of stretch it. So we say things really strange to some people. The reason why we don't own land is because it owns itself. We actually consider it to be a living being. I've addressed it as land is the elder. It's our elder relative. And as much of America has done to its elder people, is warehouse them in old folks' homes and hide them away and hope nothing bad happens, but don't really pay attention. And guess what? Bad things happen. And now we found the land in an old folks home situation being terribly abused. And that even goes for the land we've reacquired. We're happy to have our land back. We're happy to have our elder back in our company. But that elder has been terribly abused, even that little bit of land that we're on. And we are looking towards, a long journey of healing for that land at the emotional, physical, biological, economic, cultural levels. All of those are encompassed there. And we're only talking about 38 acres in this case. And that is very much true, even in those cases where indigenous people are getting their land back. I'm thinking of my relatives way up north in Eureka. The Wiyot people got their island back. Some of you may have heard that. What most people don't know is the condition of that island. In the intervening years since it was taken, it literally was corrupted. It's a Superfund site, an actually documented federal government Superfund site. And they gave it back to the natives. Thank you very much. Now they got to go clean it up. And so those are the kinds of things, those marketing gestures, I call them, in a sense, and when I say those, it sounds pretty harsh, and it is kind of, but that's the reality we have to deal with. And so when people are inconvenienced because we're taking a little bit of their privilege, we have to contrast that and sometimes talk about the other side of that. Why is it where it's being taken? What is being balanced out because of the taking? And perhaps maybe in return, you will get something back. It's not just like it's an empty hole in your life, but we're really in the work that we do and hope to do is we're rebalancing the world. That's the concept we use. We're rebalancing the world, and it's going to benefit everybody. Once you get past those fears, hopefully people will see that.
I think any of us who are living, breathing, paying attention in Northern California right now don't have to be told too many. I mean, they have to be told because they don't get it, but should get how incredibly out of balance our relationship with the land has been.
Yes.
I mean, it's I walk out my door today and breathe smoke from wildfires that again, my understanding, which may be flawed, is that the indigenous people developed a relationship with fire that meant this kind of thing didn't happen.
That's right. That's absolutely true. And so it's not just climate change in some general obscure sense, but it had directly to do with the native people, stewards of the land for thousands and thousands of years, having that responsibility forcibly taken from them and forbidden. It was forbidden by California law for us to use fire, which for us is a tool. And just like any tool, you have to be careful how you use it. You have to learn how to use it. You don't just hand a 2-year-old a real hammer. You give them, plastic ones. So when they hit their thumb, it's not too bad. If you give them a real hammer, they're going to smash the hell out of their fingers. And that's what people have done, is they're afraid of using fire because they don't know how to use it. They don't know how to use the tool. And they took it away from the people who did know how to use it. And now we're seeing the result of 150, 200 years of lack of caretaking of our elder. And that elder is pretty upset. And it's showing its upsetness. And as our elders always told us, the land doesn't need us. We need the land. And if nobody will take care of it, it'll take care of itself. And that's what a lot of our elders, and I personally also believe, it's taking care of itself because the people responsible for it were not allowed, and the people that took it over didn't do the job. So it's doing it itself. And we're seeing that, and it's seeing it in a way that is disregarding our needs because it has its own needs. Because in the end, if those forests aren't healthy, it doesn't matter what we do. It's still going to be the end of us. And that's really what climate change is about. And all these other things we're talking about within that colonial system are not separate topics. They're not separate subjects. They're not extraneous things that have nothing to do with it. It's all part of the same system and mindset. And you can't just like take care of one, because the other ones will come in and supplant that mindset. You have to rethink things on a fundamental level. And that's what's scary to some people, because they've never been taught that there's other ways to do things.
To look
A
at,
fear.
Right.
Yeah, it's the fear that really drives a lot of this. The fear of scarcity. Once you have private property, you have those who have and those who don't have. Once you have desperation, you have a group of people who'll be willing to sell anything to have what they need. So the whole architecture of colonial capitalist society is structured to manufacture that desperation. That's why people are dropping their kids off at school right now when they don't feel safe. It's because they feel desperate. They have to get back to work. They have to participate in this system. And so if we were to imagine a reality in Yelamu that wasn't driven by desperation, what would that look like? If we were to imagine, Greg said something about San Francisco not being conducive to Indigenous presence, right? And I think Jeantelle said something similar to like that the environment, people feel they have to leave because they can't stay. Can we imagine a Yelamu that was conducive to Indigenous presence? What does that Yelamu look like? What does it feel like? What is there? What is in place so that that presence can thrive? And if that's in place, how do these other things fall into place? And that does require a whole shifting of a mindset away from scarcity, away from desperation into one of being held by systems, many systems. And that's not just magical thinking like cafe gratitude, I am grateful, I am abundant, blah, blah, blah. That is like dismantling the structures that are making that scarcity a real experience every day for people. And so I'm down for whatever work that looks like. And I think that if we can create a Yelamu that's conducive for Ramaytush-Ohlone presence, what does that look like?
one of the things that it does not look like is seeing the planet as a place from which to extract wealth, and seeing the city as a place from which to extract wealth. And, you know, I sometimes look at this as, you know, obviously the San Francisco that the capitalist San Francisco we live in now was based on extractive capital, extracting, you know, extracting things from the earth, extracting labor from people, like extracting and taking. And Greg, you can, I know you can talk more about this and better about this than I, but I sometimes see the opposite of abstraction as community building. Like, community building means we're putting something into, as opposed to taking something out of. And all of San Francisco has been about for, you know, at least a couple hundred years, is finding ways to extract wealth from the land, to build buildings and rent them out, to speculate on the land, to extract wealth from it, as opposed to putting into building community.
And building community means building relationships. And it starts at the personal human level of building relationships. That's what really community is really about. The rest is kind of like, it's structural, it's logistics, it's administrative, but the fundamental is building relationships. Our culture, our spiritual, social, cultural values, all are predicated on relationship building as a community, not as individuals. You know, we don't talk about, in our languages, most of the California languages I'm aware of, there isn't much in the way of I. All the structure of the language itself is built around we, us. It's plural. It's meant to be a community. And that starts with the land itself. As I said, it's our elder. We build a relationship with our elder that gave birth to us, like a mother. So we have a relationship that we continually renew every single day with songs, with ceremony, with practical things like harvesting in a good way that does not damage, but actually enhances, right? Fire is just one of the tools we used. And when we used it, that tool and other tools, not only did it not damage, it made it better, right? Modern science knows some of that, right? Pruning, right? If you know when and how to prune, you actually get more and better fruit. That's exactly what our ancestors learned about thousands of years ago. And it applied to everything we do, including each other. So that idea of the binary of the individual, and it's got to be me or them, is the crux of the matter to me. In terms of like taking wealth, right? Even if we only take a little bit, but you're taking something and they're fearful that it's going to be the thing that they need tomorrow. And really what it's about is rebalancing the community and those relationships that have been broken and heavily damaged with the land, with each other. And that's where it starts, at that fundamental level. The rest can be built on top of that, because when you build a relationship, right? Let's say you're in a neighborhood. You have a great neighborhood. You've been there for a long time. You know your neighbors. You look out for each other, right? Somebody's looking out their window and they see across the street at your place, somebody's breaking into your house. What are they going to do? Go back and watch TV? No, they're probably going to call you. They're going to call somebody because they're watching out for you. If you know the people across the street, your friends, maybe their kids didn't get lunch the last 2 days. Maybe they're a little short on cash. Maybe they're having problems. What are you going to do about that, right? When we extend that idea to everyone is our neighbor, everybody is our relative. And that is the central concept of indigenous culture. Everything is our relative. Everything has life. Everything has value equally. So we don't say it's us or the land. It's us and the land. It's the land inside of us. So when you put it in that modern structure of us or them, you get the hysteria that you have now. And you have to, and one of the things we tell people when they ask us, do they want to learn our indigenous values? Well, you know what? You're all indigenous. You just may not remember, even less so than us. You're all indigenous. These are values that are relatively new in human history, constructed values of quote unquote civilization that isn't terribly civilized in our view. My elder mentor talked about, so-called civilization not being terribly humane because they forgot its indigenous values, wherever they came from, because those values are shared values that I've learned from other indigenous people all around the world. They have some of those very fundamentals. How it's constructed is very much particular to the land they came from. But the fundamentals of a relationship with that place is ubiquitous. It's universal. And everybody would benefit by remembering their own indigenous values where they came from. And of course, the system is fighting hard against it and is structured to not have us remember. And lots of indigenous people, as whether other cultures, our Black American relatives, our Asian relatives, are encouraged, if not forcibly told to forget those values. And guess what? My elder taught me before he crossed over that everybody is born with that seed and they can all remember. It all comes back when you start building that relationship with the land.
Thank you so much. We are almost out of time, and I am not seeing a lot of questions or comments from the participants, which is just fine. You're not required to ask questions if you don't want to. I really appreciate having all of you here. I think maybe that on that incredible note, I will stop and thank everybody for your time. This is incredibly thought-provoking and incredibly helpful. And I know some of my students are here. This will definitely be part of our discussions this fall as we move forward with this. And I will 48 Hills and USF, about USF class will be in touch with all of you more to talk more about these ideas, because this is absolutely fantastic. And I'm really excited that we are going to be able, that we've recorded this and that we'll be able to put this out for many, many more people to view in the future. So I can't thank you all enough. My panelists, thank you for coming through. Thank you, Greg and Rupa, for coming through really at the last minute and the last day. And making time to do this. Kim-Shree and Jeantelle, I know you're both really busy people. Thank you for taking time to do this. It's just been wonderful.
Thank you, everyone.
Virtual
Thank
applause for
you.
everybody.
Thank you.
I will let you all go, and I will make sure that this is recorded and out there. As soon as we have a link, I will send it to you.